probably no secret to you by now that I am quite a big fan of 3D printing. I have a website that sells 3D printed things that I've designed, and I own and operate 3 printers, even if I do hate 1.5 of them. So you might be willing to assume that I would love it if the rise of 3D printing was to kill off mass-produced miniatures companies, right? And drive all that custom in a direction that I personally benefit from. But you'd be wrong. Long has it been being asserted now in certain dark corners of the internet that 3D printing could well kill off large miniatures companies, readers, Games Workshop. And that could be true one day. But that day is a very long way away, and 3D printing has a long road to travel before it can be the de facto way for most wargamers to acquire their miniatures. Today I want to talk about a few of the reasons why this might not be the case, and also why falsely inflating the position of 3D printing can have some broader and more damaging effects. First of all, we need to talk about the true cost of 3D printing versus buying mass-produced miniatures, and we're going to start with money because that's just a good baseline for most people. Money talks. Undoubtedly, the most popular 3D printer at the moment is still the Elegoo Mars 2 Pro, and they'll occasionally pop up on sale, in fact with some frequency. But if you're not willing to wait for one of those sales, that is a £250 machine. And then you're going to need resin to print an army. What's that? 2 bottles? 3 bottles to get a full army done? Well, based on my experience of printing about 1500 points of feudal-styled Imperial Guard, probably more like 4 bottles? Maybe even 5 bottles? So I think we need to add at least another £175 in resin costs, just to be on the safe side. And in the interest of fairness, I'm going to say we're using water washable resin here, so you don't have to fork out any extra for alcohol. However, you do still need to cure those resin miniatures, be able to clean them up and handle them safely and correctly. And in order to do this, you're going to want things like a UV nail lamp, which is probably the cheaper of the decent options for UV curing. You're going to want things like a few tubs and bowls and stuff like that to wash in. You're going to want a box of gloves. You're going to want a horrendous amount of kitchen paper. It's going to probably conservatively add another £60. So we don't actually own a single miniature yet, and we've already spent £485. Now, if you looked at my recent shootout video comparing the value points of different army-based miniatures games, that's about the same as an entire 40k army and all the books to support it. But 40k isn't the only game out there, and for that same amount of money you could own 3 or 4 full armies for Infinity, countless Stargrave or Frostgrave warbands, or 4 entire Kings of War armies for a more apples to apples army to army comparison. And we're going to talk about why this matters later. So we've spent all of our money, and now we need to know what to actually do with this new equipment that we've bought. This means we need to spend time learning things, and time is not a free resource. I mean, sure, you're going to be able to get functional test prints within 20 minutes of first setting up your printer, but making an actual usable army is going to require you to learn how to support your prints. This takes time and trial and error, which means wastage. You're also going to have to spend time setting up each print, waiting for it to print, cleaning it up afterwards, curing it, and doing the finer prep work that you have to do to printed miniatures before you can paint them. So yeah, it's just all a lot of time. Next, it's probably worth making you aware that not all of the STL files out there for printing armies are free. You may well have to pay for them. I mean, free STLs do exist, but if you're trying to print full armies for other games, the chances are you're either not going to be using free STLs, or the STLs that you're using, if they are free, may come with some legal or moral implications that you're not necessarily going to be comfortable with. Now, we could continue to deep dive on cost alone, probably for an entire video, because cost is a huge thing that separates the two. But let's look at some of the other things that contribute. So you remember earlier when I said 40k isn't the only game out there? Sure, a lot of the current discourse is absolutely about sticking it to the man, and the particular man that many of you feel like needs it sticking to them is Games Workshop, and more specifically, Warhammer 40k. But for every false argument that incorrectly inflates 3D printing, there's potential there to do harm to smaller independent businesses through a knock-on effect of their association of making a similar product. If faith in miniatures is low, faith in miniatures companies will naturally be coming down with it. And it is in fact these small companies with their well-supported games and their excellent customer service track records that are in the much stronger, more realistic position to claw back some market share from Games Workshop. So the secret, if you really want to stick it to the man, and assuming the man in this case is Games Workshop, is to play Infinity! Or whatever other smaller games you like. But the point being that if you're 3D printing an army for 40k, you're still drawing people's attention to 40k. It's much the same with things like one-page rules, that because they're so heavily based on Games Workshop's properties, still draw attention to Games Workshop. So these things can never really be considered true alternatives to steer people away from that one massive centre. The next thing we need to talk about is the level of faff and messing around. You've probably heard the phrase by now, 3D printing is a hobby in its own right. Have you ever stopped maybe to consider what people mean by that? Imagine waiting 6 to 8 hours for your new 3D printed Dreadnought to finish printing. You remove it from the build plate only to find it's failed. It can take the tiniest of errors to cause a printing failure. And every single failure you have means cleaning down the equipment, discarding those failures, setting up again, and waiting again for the print. Usually with a pretty hefty amount of frustration on top. It's all well and good bragging that your 3D printed Dreadnought only cost you £2 worth of resin to make, but one simple failure turns that into not only £4, but 16 hours of waiting. In that same amount of time, you can go to a shop, buy a mass-produced miniature, bring it home, assemble it, and completely paint it to a pretty high standard. I mean, this Dreadnought that I've been showing you here, this took me about 10 hours, maybe a bit less than that. So 3D printing isn't really winning on price. I mean, sure, you get that equipment going forward, but you do still have to continue to finance and maintain it. It's not winning on sticking it to the man because it's just not the best option, and most of the most viable ways to use 3D printing instead of feeding the man involve still promoting the man. But it's also not winning on convenience, where there's just a lot of learning and time and waiting and effort and cleaning up and things that you don't have to do with mass-produced miniatures. So if I'm so pro 3D printing, what actually is the advantage? Why should we even be praising it? Well, the answer is access. If you're willing to put up with the finagling and the potential failures and the expensive replacement parts and the waiting, oh god, the waiting, 3D printing grants a new level of access to miniatures that we've never seen before, and it's truly incredible. Whether it's a unique centerpiece for D&D, some conversion bits, some cool sci-fi scenery, all of it is possible with a 3D printer thanks to sites like My Mini Factory, who provide a one-stop shop for these things. 3D printing is absolutely revolutionary in granting people the ability to find exactly what they're looking for easier and quicker than ever before. The cost of that is just that it requires some learning and a lot of time investment. And it is for exactly this reason that it will always be a separate hobby, in its current iteration at least, and never really able to be a proper threat to mass-produced models. But the truth underneath all of that is, it's also just not trying to be. We all know, regardless of how pissed off we might be at Games Workshop, that piracy is wrong. And sure, 3D printing does contain within it some avenues through which people commit piracy. But if you look at the vast majority of 3D printing creators out there, everything that they're making is original and innovative, and they're really not trying to pirate things. The industry as a whole is extremely anti-piracy. And so perhaps the takeaways that you should have from watching this video are that printing isn't really set up to take on the mass-produced market. It isn't cheaper, it isn't more convenient, and most importantly, the vast majority of people that support it don't want to replace the mainstream, and so it won't. So thanks for watching, folks. Don't forget to like this video if you liked it, to subscribe to the channel and enable notifications if you want to see more, and if you'd like to support the channel, to check the links down below for ways that you can do that. You'll also find my social media links down there if you want to join me in discussing topics like this on Twitter or Facebook. So folks, I'd like to wish you all happy hobbying. I will see you in the next one, and bye bye for now.